On a seemingly ordinary day in 1957, an invisible force tore through the quiet Ural Mountains, leaving a trail of destruction and contamination that would remain hidden from the world for decades. This was the Kyshtym Disaster, a catastrophic nuclear incident shrouded in secrecy, unfolding in the heart of the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. Its impact was profound, devastating thousands of lives and contaminating vast stretches of land, but its existence was denied for years, buried beneath layers of government censorship and silence. In the rural town of Kyshtym and its surrounding villages, life was simple. People tilled the fields, raised livestock, and went about their daily routines, blissfully unaware of the shadow looming over them. Just a few miles away, hidden within a heavily guarded facility, the Soviet government's secretive nuclear program was in full swing. Unknown to the villagers, their idyllic surroundings masked a ticking time bomb. The explosion came without warning, silent, invisible, and deadly. A plume of radioactive contamination rose into the air, spreading toxic particles across hundreds of miles. Within days, entire villages were abandoned, their residents evacuated in haste, or left to fend for themselves. For those who stayed behind, the consequences were dire. Illness and death followed, creeping in silently like the disaster itself. But this wasn't just a tragedy of nature or technology. The Kyshtym disaster revealed the devastating cost of secrecy and the lengths to which governments will go to hide their failures. It's a story of human ingenuity turned catastrophic, of lives upended by forces they could neither see nor understand. For decades, the world knew nothing of this event. Overshadowed by the later Chernobyl disaster, it became one of history's forgotten catastrophes. Today, as we uncover the truth behind the Kyshtym disaster, we are reminded of the hidden dangers that come with power, progress, and secrecy. This is the story of a disaster that almost vanished from memory, of the lives it touched, and of the lessons it holds for a world still grappling with the consequences of nuclear energy. To understand the Kyshtym disaster, we must journey back to the early days of the Cold War, a time of intense rivalry between global superpowers, where technological advancements were pursued with reckless urgency. In the aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union had launched an ambitious and secretive nuclear program, racing to build an arsenal that could rival the United States. At the center of this effort was the Mayak Production Association, a sprawling nuclear facility nestled deep in the Ural Mountains. Constructed in the late 1940s, Mayak was a monumental achievement for Soviet science and industry. Located near the town of Kyshtym in the Chelyabinsk Oblast, the facility was deliberately placed in a remote area to ensure secrecy and security. The surrounding terrain was rugged and sparsely populated, with dense forests and rolling hills creating a natural barrier against prying eyes. The people who lived in nearby villages were largely farmers and laborers, unaware of the immense risks posed by their proximity to the nuclear plant. The Mayak facility was built at breakneck speed, driven by the Soviet Union's desire to develop nuclear weapons as quickly as possible. This urgency came with significant compromises. Safety protocols were often overlooked or entirely ignored, and the infrastructure was hastily designed and poorly maintained. The facility's primary role was to produce weapons-grade plutonium, a process that generated immense amounts of radioactive waste. This waste was stored in underground tanks, cooled by a complex system of pipes and pumps. But the system was far from foolproof. Throughout the 1950s, Mayak operated under a shroud of secrecy. Workers at the facility were sworn to silence, and the surrounding population knew little about what went on within its guarded perimeter. Even the name Kyshtym Disaster is somewhat misleading, as the event did not directly occur in the town of Kyshtym. Instead, it was named after the closest identifiable location in the area, as the actual site of the disaster, the Mayak facility, was kept classified for decades. The cultural and political context of the time played a significant role in shaping the events leading up to the disaster. The Soviet Union's culture of secrecy extended beyond its nuclear program to all aspects of governance. Information about potential dangers, safety lapses, or environmental impacts was tightly controlled. Citizens were rarely informed of risks, and dissent was often silenced. In this environment, warning signs that might have prevented the disaster were ignored or suppressed. The technological context was equally critical. The Mayak facility relied on primitive and untested methods for handling radioactive waste. At the time, nuclear science was still in its infancy, and the long-term consequences of radioactive contamination were poorly understood. The storage tanks used at Mayak were designed to contain highly radioactive liquid waste, but they lacked redundancy and proper cooling mechanisms. Over time, these tanks became ticking time bombs, waiting for a single failure to unleash catastrophe. In the years leading up to 1957, the warning signs were already there. Workers reported leaks and malfunctions in the cooling system, but these issues were often dismissed or patched up with temporary fixes. The pressure to meet production quotas for plutonium overshadowed concerns about safety. Additionally, the remote location of the facility meant that it operated with little oversight or accountability. It was a perfect storm of technological hubris, secrecy, and complacency. The people living near the facility were blissfully unaware of the danger. Many were subsistence farmers who depended on the land for their livelihood. The rivers and streams that flowed through the area provided water for drinking and irrigation, while the forests offered wood for fuel and shelter. Life in the villages was simple and deeply connected to the natural environment, a stark contrast to the high-stakes nuclear experiments happening just miles away. By 1957, the Mayak facility was already a site of significant environmental contamination. Radioactive waste had been routinely discharged into the nearby Techa River, exposing countless villagers to harmful radiation. Reports of illness and deformities were quietly dismissed by local authorities, who prioritized secrecy over public health. This pattern of neglect and denial would reach its breaking point on September 29, 1957, when one of the facility's underground storage tanks experienced a catastrophic failure. The stage was set for disaster. The combination of flawed technology, inadequate safety measures, and a culture of secrecy created a volatile situation that was bound to explode, both literally and figuratively. The Kyshtym disaster would not only devastate the surrounding region, but also expose the human cost of unchecked ambition and secrecy in the pursuit of progress. The explosion on September 29, 1957, was both catastrophic and surreal. Without warning, one of the underground storage tanks containing over 70 tons of radioactive waste detonated, releasing a plume of radioactive particles into the atmosphere. The blast was so powerful that it created a crater nearly 50 meters wide and sent a glowing cloud of contamination billowing into the sky. This marked the beginning of one of the most devastating nuclear disasters in history. Those working at the facility that day described the moment as eerily quiet before chaos unfolded. Anna, a chemical technician, remembered feeling the ground tremble beneath her feet. She thought it might be an earthquake until a deafening rumble shattered the stillness. Looking out the window, she saw a glowing reddish-orange cloud rising into the sky, a sight both mesmerizing and terrifying. It was as if the heavens had opened, she later recounted. Within moments, alarms blared and workers were ordered to evacuate, though many had no idea what had happened. In nearby villages, the explosion was mistaken for a thunderstorm. Residents saw the ominous clouds spreading across the sky but had no reason to suspect the danger it carried. Children playing outside stopped to stare at the strange spectacle, while farmers tending their fields watched in confusion. For many, this would be their last peaceful moment before the invisible effects of radiation began to take hold. In the village of Musliumovo, just 40 kilometers from the epicenter, life went on as usual in the hours following the explosion. The villagers were not informed of the disaster, nor were they warned of the radioactive cloud drifting toward them. Mikhail, a farmer, later described how his cattle began acting strangely, refusing to eat or drink. By evening, several animals had collapsed, their skin blistered and oozing. It wasn't until days later that officials arrived, not to explain or evacuate, but to enforce silence. In the days following the explosion, radiation sickness began to manifest in those exposed to the fallout. Residents complained of nausea, vomiting, and intense fatigue, symptoms that many initially attributed to food poisoning or a flu outbreak. It wasn't until livestock began dying en masse and crops wilted overnight that the true extent of the disaster became apparent. Still, no one came to help. For the villagers in the affected area, the lack of information was as devastating as the radiation itself. Officials from the Mayak facility, under strict orders from the Soviet government, deliberately downplayed the situation. Instead of evacuating the population, they issued vague instructions to remain indoors and avoid drinking from local water sources. Advice that came far too late for many. One of the hardest hit areas was the village of Techa, which lay along the contaminated river of the same name. Natalia, a schoolteacher, described how the river, once the lifeblood of the community, became a source of death. Children who played in its waters developed severe burns, and adults who drank from it fell ill within days. "We knew something was terribly wrong," Natalia said, "but no one told us what to do." In the weeks following the explosion, government officials began a partial evacuation of the most heavily contaminated areas. The process was haphazard and secretive, with no explanation given to those being relocated. Some families were forced to leave everything behind, while others refused to go, unwilling to abandon their homes and livelihoods. For those who stayed, the effects of radiation exposure became a grim reality. Hair loss, skin lesions, and unexplained deaths swept through the villages, leaving survivors in a state of shock and despair. One particularly haunting account came from Ivan, a factory worker who lived just outside the evacuation zone. He described how his wife and 2 young children fell ill within weeks of the disaster. They were strong and healthy, and then they just faded, he said, his voice breaking. There was nothing I could do. Even as the immediate effects of the disaster unfolded, the Soviet government worked tirelessly to suppress information. Survivors were forbidden from speaking about their experiences, and the contaminated zone was quietly cordoned off. Entire villages were erased from maps, their names and histories lost to secrecy. In the contaminated zone, life became a surreal nightmare. Those who remained faced not only the physical effects of radiation, but also the psychological toll of isolation and abandonment. Without access to medical care or support, many succumbed to their injuries, while others endured years of illness and suffering. Amid the devastation, there were stories of resilience. One villager, Galina, took it upon herself to care for her neighbors, using traditional herbal remedies to ease their symptoms. "We had no doctors, no medicine," she recalled, "but we had each other." Though many of her efforts were ultimately futile, her determination symbolized the indomitable spirit of those who refused to give up, even in the face of unimaginable odds. Another survivor, Boris, recounted how his family fled the area on foot, traveling for days until they reached a town far enough away to escape the worst of the contamination. "We had nothing but the clothes on our backs," he said, "but at least we were alive." The Kyshtym disaster left an indelible mark on those who lived through it. For the survivors, the memories of that silent explosion and its aftermath remain a haunting testament to the cost of secrecy and the fragility of human life in the face of unchecked technological power. It was not merely a catastrophic nuclear incident. It was a stark revelation of the dangers posed by secrecy, unchecked ambition, and a lack of safety oversight in high-stakes industries. The disaster was the result of a series of interconnected factors, each compounding the risks until they culminated in one of the most devastating radioactive releases in history. By examining these factors, we can better understand how such a tragedy came to pass and why its consequences were so far-reaching. At the core of the disaster was the explosion of a poorly maintained radioactive waste storage tank. The tanks at the Mayak facility were built to hold liquid radioactive waste, a byproduct of plutonium production, and relied on a cooling system to prevent overheating. However, in the years leading up to the disaster, the cooling system in one of these tanks began to malfunction. Instead of addressing the root cause, workers implemented makeshift fixes, relying on temporary measures to keep the system operational. By September 1957, the cooling system in one tank had completely failed. The highly radioactive waste inside began to heat up due to ongoing chemical reactions, eventually reaching a critical temperature. This process, known as a thermal runaway reaction, caused pressure to build until the tank could no longer contain it. The resulting explosion released an estimated 20 million curies of radioactive material into the atmosphere, a figure second only to the Chernobyl disaster decades later. One of the most significant factors contributing to the disaster was the Soviet Union's culture of cover-ups. During the Cold War, the race to develop and expand nuclear weapons took precedence over transparency and safety. The Mayak facility was constructed quickly and under immense pressure to produce weapons-grade plutonium. In this environment, safety concerns were often ignored or suppressed to meet production deadlines. Even after the explosion, the Soviet government prioritized secrecy over the welfare of its citizens. The disaster was not officially acknowledged until decades later, and information about the event was heavily censored. Villagers in the affected areas were given little to no explanation about what had occurred, and the evacuation efforts were disorganized and incomplete. Entire communities were abandoned to their fate, left to grapple with the effects of radiation exposure without guidance or assistance. This extended beyond the immediate aftermath. Scientists and medical professionals were barred from studying the long-term impacts of the disaster, and the contaminated zone was effectively erased from official records. The government's refusal to confront the truth not only prolonged the suffering of survivors, but also hindered efforts to prevent similar incidents in the future. The radioactive material released during the explosion spread over a vast area, creating what is now known as the East Ural Radioactive Trace, EURT. This contamination zone stretched more than 20,000 square kilometers, encompassing farmland, forests, and entire villages. The radioactive fallout infiltrated the soil, water, and air, creating an environment where life itself became hazardous. For those exposed to the radiation, the health consequences were devastating. Acute radiation sickness claimed many lives in the weeks following the disaster. Symptoms included nausea, vomiting, burns, and severe fatigue. Long-term effects were equally grim, with survivors experiencing high rates of cancer, genetic mutations, and other chronic illnesses. Children born in the years after the disaster often suffered from birth defects and developmental issues, adding a generational layer to the tragedy. The environmental damage was equally severe. Farmlands were rendered unusable, rivers and streams became contaminated, and wildlife populations plummeted. The area surrounding the Mayak facility became a radioactive wasteland, with some parts remaining uninhabitable to this day. Even now, the long-lasting isotopes in the soil and water pose a risk to anyone who ventures into the exclusion zone. The Kyshtym disaster was not just the result of a single technological failure, but a systemic breakdown at multiple levels. Poorly designed infrastructure, inadequate maintenance, and a lack of accountability all played a role. Workers at the Mayak facility were poorly trained in handling radioactive materials, and safety protocols were either non-existent or ignored. The government's prioritization of production over safety created an environment where risks were routinely underestimated. Furthermore, the Soviet Union's failure to communicate the dangers of radiation exposure left the affected population vulnerable. Villagers were not educated about the risks of contaminated food, water, and soil, leading many to unknowingly expose themselves further. The absence of effective emergency response measures compounded the disaster, turning what might have been a contained incident into a full-scale catastrophe. While the Kyshtym disaster remains one of the most severe nuclear incidents in history, it is often overshadowed by events like Chernobyl and Fukushima. Unlike these disasters, Kyshtym's immediate impact was localized, and the Soviet government's secrecy ensured that the world remained largely unaware of its existence for decades. However, the underlying causes, poor safety practices, technological failures, and government mismanagement, are strikingly similar. At its core, the Kyshtym disaster is a deeply human story. The survivors, ordinary villagers who lived simple, rural lives, became the unwilling participants in a nightmare they neither caused nor understood. Many were left to endure the horrors of radiation sickness, while others faced the lifelong trauma of losing their loved ones and homes. The psychological scars of isolation, betrayal, and abandonment continue to linger in the memories of those who lived through the event. Even more haunting are the stories of those who didn't survive. Entire families were wiped out in the days and weeks following the explosion, their lives cut short by an invisible, incomprehensible force. For these victims, the disaster wasn't just a technological failure, it was a profound and personal tragedy. A story of lives ended too soon by forces beyond their control. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Kyshtym disaster is the extent to which it was concealed. For decades, the Soviet government denied the event's existence, erasing entire villages from maps and forbidding survivors from speaking out. This culture of secrecy not only prolonged the suffering of those affected, but also prevented the world from learning vital lessons about the dangers of nuclear energy. The decision to suppress information about Kyshtym was emblematic of a broader pattern of denial and obfuscation in the Soviet Union. Yet the consequences of such secrecy extend far beyond the disaster itself. By hiding the truth, the government undermined trust in its institutions and delayed critical advancements in nuclear safety. The Kyshtym disaster serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing reputation over responsibility. This event remains one of the least known nuclear disasters in history. It is a sobering reflection of humanity's capacity for both innovation and destruction. It challenges us to confront the ethical dilemmas of progress and the fragile balance between humanity and the forces we seek to control. As we look back on this forgotten catastrophe, we are reminded that the lessons of the past remain as vital as ever in shaping the choices of tomorrow. For more fascinating horror, hit the like button and subscribe.